Welcome to Decision Analyst Insider Series webinar on advertising pretesting. My name is Christy Allen. I am the Marketing Director at Decision Analyst and the moderator today. Before I introduce our presenters, I have a few notes for everyone. In the handout section, there is a copy of today's presentation along with some white papers. Also, please feel free to ask any questions by typing in the chat box. We will attempt to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. If we don't answer your question during the webinar, someone will respond to your question within a day or two. Today's presenters are Jerry Thomas, President and CEO of Decision Analyst. He has worked with many major corporate clients on advertising strategy and advertising research over the years, and Bonnie Kenoly, Executive Vice President. Bonnie is an expert on communications and advertising to improve strategy and performance for global businesses. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Jerry.
Hi, this is Jerry. Welcome to today's webinar on advertising pretesting. And it's also a presentation about the power of advertising, and we'll talk more about that as we go through the presentation. Advertising pretesting refers to some type of evaluation of the advertising before it's put in a magazine or before it's aired. Today's presentation will focus on television advertising because that's still the predominant advertising in terms of dollar value. Advertising is all about changing human behavior. We have very limited options to influence other people. There are incentives, positive and negative, and then there is persuasion and advertising. So advertising is all about changing human behavior. And it can be used for good purposes, to drink alcohol responsibly, to buckle the seat belt, eat more chicken, or it can be used for evil purposes. But it is a very powerful medium. Advertising works in several very important and some subtle ways. The first task of advertising is to build awareness of a brand, a message, or an idea. And awareness alone is one of the primary mechanisms by which advertising works. Advertising helps set the agenda. It focuses your attention. It suggests. It reminds. And this setting the agenda, our mind can think about millions of different things, but advertising can help our mind begin to focus on a particular topic or a particular product category or a particular brand. So this setting the agenda, this focusing of attention, is one of the mechanisms by which advertising works. Advertising has news value. It educates, it communicates facts and information, another basic mechanism by which advertising works. Advertising also evokes human emotions and appeals to human emotions. And this is one of the underlying mechanisms that contributes to advertising effectiveness. Advertising can create a model or an example or an ideal that we may choose to emulate, identify with, or copy. And these are the primary ways in which advertising works. But creating great advertising is not easy. We all want to create great advertising, but the barriers can be formidable. First, creating great advertising is really difficult. I've been married for many years, and I have difficulty at times communicating with my wife. And when I can see her facial expressions and hear the tone of her voice, and communication is still difficult. So think about how much more difficult it is to try to communicate with some vast audience that's invisible through broadcast media. It's a very difficult task. The second barrier to great advertising is self-delusion. We all believe that we are good judges of advertising. We're kind of self-appointed and self-anointed experts of advertising. And we may say we don't believe this, but I think in our heart of hearts, we all believe that we are able to recognize great advertising. The truth is, and this is based on 40 years of testing advertising, none of us can really do it. We think we can, but we can't. Love is another barrier. Once advertising agencies and the marketing department start working with developing a new advertising campaign, they begin to fall in love with a particular approach or an idea or a concept. And once the agency and the marketing department begin to fall in love with the advertising, they are very resistant to any type of testing. They refuse to accept any type of negative feedback because, you know, love is blind and love is deaf. Another barrier to great advertising is the belief among senior executives that they can just throw the advertising on air and then watch sales response out in the marketplace, and that'll reveal if the advertising is working or not. So when the economy is strong and sales are going up, we've seen a lot of really bad campaigns stay on air for years, and when the economy is going down, we've seen great campaigns canceled. You can't trust sales in most cases to tell you whether the advertising is working or not. Strategy. Perhaps the greatest barrier to effective advertising is no underlying strategy or poor strategy. What's the purpose or role of the advertising? What's it supposed to accomplish? And this can be different for every product, every brand, every market condition. So there has to be an underlying strategy, and that is the foundation and the key to great advertising. And then the last barrier is the lack of pre-testing. Most advertising is aired without any type of pre-testing. You know, and well-managed major corporations tend to test some of their advertising, but even those companies often fail to test all of their creative executions. But overall, I've heard estimates as low as 1% of the advertising that appears on television is actually submitted or subjected to any type of pre-testing before airing. So lack of pre-testing is another barrier to great advertising. There are a number of different types of pre-testing systems, and I'm going to ask Bonnie to start this section off, and she and I will tag team as we work through the presentation from this point forward.
Hello everyone. We're going to be talking a few moments about the different types of pre-testing systems. First of all, the theater approach is one of the common approaches in which consumers are recruited in to watch a television program, and that's the task they are given, and the commercials are embedded within that. And so throughout that, this is a self-reported impact, and we evaluate how consumers are reacting to these commercials. And obviously they're seeing multiple commercials, so it is similar to a television program in that sense, but you wouldn't normally be watching television in a theater, so there is risk of group bias and conditioning. Some of the respondents may be recruited repeatedly or do this kind of work over and over, so again, not necessarily representative samples. It also tends to be quite expensive.
Day after recall is another commonly used advertising pre-testing system, but I need to put that in the past tense. day after recall was actually the first and the most important type of advertising pretesting. It was popularized by Procter & Gamble many years ago. But that was an era when there were 3 major television networks, and it was possible to do a survey 24 hours after a commercial was aired and find enough people who viewed the commercial to do the 24-hour recall. So this is a method you should be aware of, but it's essentially not used anymore because of the fragmentation of TV media and the fact that it's very expensive, and typically it's limited to a market or two, so there are sampling issues. And we've also learned over the last 25 years that recall is a relatively, I'm talking about advertising message recall, is a weak predictor of commercial effectiveness. And the diagnostics are very poor in the 24-hour recall because people can't remember what they viewed 24 hours before. And of course now it's prohibitively expensive.
And I believe, to follow up on that, the Advertising Research Foundation did a series of copy research validation projects back in the 90s and found that, again, that was not one of the best predictors of success of a campaign. And the next one we're going to talk about is split cable TV panels. And again, here we've got half of the household seeing commercial A, half seeing commercial B, and then the panel of sales are being tracked. So in terms of a scientific experiment, it is nearly perfect. Again, there can be sampling issues about the sample not being representative, and obviously it's difficult to capture all the purchases and very poor diagnostics. The other issue here is that we can't really measure the long-term effects of the advertising on the brand, and again, can be very, very expensive. So it's incredibly rare nowadays that people would be doing this type of system.
Digital ad testing, A/B testing, is another common type of a pretesting system. And in this approach, digital ads are randomized or systematically rotated, and the response or clicks are tracked. And this approach can suggest which of 2 ads might be better. But clicks don't fully capture all of someone's response. You know, they're both short-term effects and long-term effects of advertising that can't be captured or measured by clicks. So digital A/B testing has its place. It's relatively inexpensive, but it's very limited in what it can do. So be very careful in using this and don't put too much faith in it.
The next one we're going to talk about is test markets. Real live test markets can be thought of and used, and here again, ad A is tested in one set of markets and ad B is in a matched set tested there, and the results are tracked. And again, from an experimental design, it's very appealing, but it's very difficult to execute given that there are sampling issues. How can the markets be exactly representative depending on your brand or your store? You know, what is the penetration in that region or in that set of markets relative to the other one? The other issues are the generally poor diagnostics, and again, can be quite expensive.
Another great advantage, though, Bonnie, of the A/B type actual test markets, you know, where you have a set of test markets and control markets, is that they're great for doing advertising spending level tests. And these may go on for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And those, you know, control tests are wonderful for doing spending level tests. Qualitative research is widely used to review and investigate early stage creative. We typically recommend that our clients do depth interviews as the method of data collection rather than focus groups when qualitative is being used to evaluate advertising. And the primary reason is because in a group setting, people tend to learn from each other, and so if one person understands the commercial in a group, they can quickly reveal what they know, and then everyone knows what the commercial is trying to say. But in a depth interview, you would find that 9 out of 10 people didn't really understand the commercial. So we like the depth interview over focus groups for qualitative research. And the groups, or the depth interviews primarily, are great for diagnostics. But the samples are small and unprojectable, so you have to be careful. And then qualitative research is subjective or observational information, and there's always the risk of prejudice or bias.
And one of the things we also really like about the qualitative aspect, if you go that route in pre-testing early stage advertising, is that you may learn other things. You may learn that some very important information about the advertising, but you may learn about the product or the brand, and other things may be uncovered. So again, depending on where you are in process, that can be very important. The online testing really began in the 1990s, and several advertising pre-testing companies at that point moved quickly to adapt their systems to online testing, and essentially the consumers are exposed to the television commercial on their computer monitor or laptop or tablet. We do not typically recommend that these surveys be tested on smartphones given the size, and we want to kind of emulate what goes on in a little bit of a bigger screen. So after exposure to the commercial, the consumer fills out a survey, and the big advantage here is that you do control the sampling pretty well, and you can test all over the country or by market or region. You get excellent diagnostics, and you can add things into that, such as the eye tracking or facial coding to a limited degree, and the costs are pretty reasonable. If we do some of the facial action coding and other techniques, typically you're bringing some of those people into a central location, so it's not all of the people who are doing that, but some subset would be doing that portion.
And we can use the camera in a laptop or a computer monitor to measure eye tracking, but it's not very accurate. But we can do facial coding online, and that can be quite accurate and can be a valuable addition to a copy test. The next section is key measures in advertising testing systems, and we'll go through these key measures that ought to be included in every advertising testing system one by one. And I'm going to ask Bonnie to lead off.
Okay, so first of all, attention value. This is the most important aspect, because obviously if we don't break through and we don't actually gain the consumer's attention, all else is lost in terms of the communication and what we're trying to do. So it's very important that our commercial is breaking through the clutter, and we can do something called a recall out of clutter reel. It is often used. It's not ideal, but essentially your ad would be in the center with perhaps 2 ads before and 2 ads after, and we can do it that way, or we can just show your commercial and do the testing. So again, you have several options in trying to understand how attention is being garnered from the commercial, and the arousal is another indicator, but it's not foolproof. And we also have 24-hour recall, which we've talked about before, not a perfect indicator, but again, pretty expensive.
And the arousal would be measured in some physiological way. It can be measured by galvanic skin response, GSR, can be measured by pupil dilation of the eye, can be measured by FAC or facial action coding. Brand registration is another key function of advertising and an important measure in any advertising evaluation system. Does the audience see and or hear the brand name, and do they remember the brand name? And this is a really important and difficult issue because there are really two dimensions of the question here. The first is, do people actually see the brand name? And the other is the brand name easy to remember or difficult to remember? It's really important to try to get at that issue, because if a brand name is very difficult to remember, then the advertising has to devote more attention to registering the brand name. Another part of the brand registration is, are people remembering the commercial as an ad for your brand, or are they remembering it as a brand for a competitor? And this is one of the risks of head-to-head comparisons in advertising. If you're comparing your brand head-to-head with another brand, the ad might be remembered as an ad for your competitor rather than your brand. So if the brand is not clearly registered, then the ad is a failure.
And we've also noticed in the past, in a lot of the ads we've tested, the more humorous, or if there's something very specific, kind of a big joke or something within the ad, many times you can lose the brand registration or it becomes minimized. And so they may recall the ad as being for a health insurance company, or they may recall the category, but it's difficult to remember that exact brand, and so that becomes a problem. Message communication, again, obviously our whole goal in advertising is to communicate a core message and trying to understand what was actually communicated as opposed to what we intended. Typically this is measured with a main idea, in which we ask an open-ended question where the consumer responds and gives us their feedback without us aiding them in any way. And the messages should match our communication objectives that the advertising was designed to communicate. And so the issue here is that there can always be hidden messages. It may be a husband and wife couple who are the characters in the ad, and perhaps something is communicated about the two actors that are in the ad as opposed to what our intended message is. So again, very important to look at those open-ended questions and make sure we understand exactly what's being communicated.
Persuasion, or, as we talked about earlier, advertising can have different purposes. The goal may be to cause people to try a brand, or it may be to get consumers to visit an automobile dealership or to go to a website. So advertising can have different end goals. But persuasion is an attempt to measure whatever this defined goal is, likelihood to purchase or visit a store. And persuasion can be measured several different ways. It can be measured with a basic purchase intent question that we would compare to norms. Classically, and most commonly, persuasion has been referred to a pre-post shift in purchase intent, where you ask a question before they see the ad and then after they see the advertising, and you look at the shift in purchase intent. And then a third way to measure persuasion is, did the advertising create any additional interest in buying the brand or visiting the dealership? And we really like this question because it works equally well even if you're already a user of the brand. So persuasion is one of those really core messages.
And the nice thing about the persuasion is it can be customized to your business. So for those in the pharma category, for example, it may be persuasion to get you to bring this topic up or to mention this drug to your doctor or physician. So again, depending on what your particular business and objectives are, we can modify that question. The likes and dislikes is the next section that we wanted to talk about. Again, typically recorded in open-ended type questions, and obviously nowadays you can also capture those by webcam if you have webcams on the computer. And it's important to understand what the likes and dislikes are. So it gives the viewer an opportunity to really tell us what they like and dislike. You can look at, you would expect the dislikes to be, not very frequent, not very often happening, and then also you're looking for what the messages are here and make sure that we aren't communicating any hidden messages.
Another measure that's grown in popularity over the last few years is engagement, or we might also refer to it as emotional involvement. And essentially it's trying to measure what emotions does the advertising evoke or appeal to. Emotions, of course, are already measured by the, quote, rational questions in the pretesting survey. So whether you intend to measure emotions or not, you're going to. And we can also put in direct questions to measure feelings and emotions. And then facial coding, FAC, facial action coding, which was developed by Charles Darwin, by the way, about 140 years ago, can also be used to measure some emotions. And then there are other neuroscience measures like GSR, heart rate, pupil dilation, brain waves, that can give us another window to look at emotional response to an ad. These measures are really still under development. They're still validation issues. They're not widely used. But if you use them carefully, they can add some additional value.
Image projection is another area in which we really want to understand what's happening in the commercial that we're testing. And this is the impression that the advertising is conveying about the brand. And what we're looking for are things like a low status, high status, low quality, high quality. And the issues here are we need to understand these because this is one of the long-term effects that our advertising will have on consumers and prospective consumers for the future. And basically this is what we're buying, and this is what we're telling this group that is our brand and what we stand for.
The image projection, you can think of it as the heavy artillery side of advertising, the longer term, the longer reach effects. The final section are some of our things that we've learned over the last 30, 40 years in testing advertising and developing good advertising. And the first principle or best practice is have a sound strategy based on facts and evidence from consumer research. It's just essential to the creation of really effective advertising. So sound strategy is extremely important. And we think that strategy is really the client's responsibility. Too often clients go to the agency and say, okay, develop great advertising for our brand. And the agency is really left guessing about what the client wants. So we really think it's the client's job to do the homework, do the research, do the strategy concept testing, to go to the agency with a blueprint for what the advertising is to achieve. Then the advertising agency can be as creative as they want, but they're doing it within that blueprint.
One of the other important areas we really need to think about is the right target. And typically we think of all the category users in a very broadly defined target as being the best or best practice. And the issue here is obviously the broadcast media typically reaches a wider audience than maybe what our narrow media target is. And it is important that we think about where the brand will be, and we're casting a wide net so that we can measure across all these various groups. So sometimes we may have a representative sample, and then we may have a boost or an augment to get more brand users, or split that other group into brand and users and non-users.
And if you have a high share brand, it's really important to have a subsample of your own brand users. And when I say high brand share, I mean above 20%. If you have a 1% brand share, then you want to use a category sample and not worry about your own users. Another best practice is pre-testing. I mentioned earlier that only about 1% of all commercials are tested in any way before they are aired. So if you have the budget, pre-test your advertising at the rough stage, the storyboard or animatic stage, and at the finished or near finished stage. Through pre-testing, the advertising can become better and better over time because each ad is a learning experiment that helps everyone get better. The creatives, the marketing executives, the brand managers.
And to build on that, staying with one pre-testing system is the best practice that we recommend. There may be changes that you make over, once or twice here or there, but you really need to stick with one system. None of the systems are perfect. There isn't one nirvana here that's going to answer every question and it's going to cover every situation. But the secret is to learn a system so that everyone, both at the client, within the marketing team and research and agency, all understand what the implications are and understand how to read the system.
Benchmarking. Another best practice. We recommend that you not place too much faith in general norms and normative databases. Generally, normative databases set the bar too low. It's too low a standard because a normative database typically includes many commercials that were failures. So that's averaged in with the good commercials. So the norm typically is too low. And you don't know what's in that normative database. You don't really know which commercials were tested. So we strongly recommend to build your own norms based on testing your own brands and testing competitive brands, because the goal here is not a norm but to eventually build an action standard for your brand, and then you can develop much better advertising, because your action standards will get better and better over time as you learn what really works.
And we have a couple of questions here. I'm going to kind of interrupt and go back to the target market we were talking about. One of the questions was around how do you define the target market, especially as the media is changing. So you may have banner ads, you may have the digital target, and you may have a television target. So again, you really need to think about what is the overall objective of the advertising and whether we have an integrated campaign that's doing television and digital, and exactly how we want to define those targets when we're testing. One of the other questions that we got was around the benchmarking, and what if your company would like to update the norms or update the benchmark or the standards?
Well, typically when we start an advertising program for a client, we will encourage them to test all of the competitive ads in their category that have been run for the last 2 or 3 years. This provides a tremendous view of the competitive landscape, and it gives us a target to shoot at. If the composite score for all the competitive ads is 40, I'm just making this up, then if we can achieve a composite score of 50, then we know that we're winning the advertising battle, assuming we have equal media weight. So we really like to test competitive ads, to use that data to help set action standards, and then you need to update those every year or two, and it's really important to do that, and then you have very precise normative standards.
And one of the other comments we had was around the advertising norms and benchmarking, and whether your industry has maybe gone through massive changes in the past, let's say 5 or so years or since 2008, then you really need to think about what might be in those norms from before that time. If you consider that kind of a different world than where we are today, then you need to talk to your company, your vendors, and find out what exactly is in that norm and try to update it to more of the more current, maybe 2 to 5 years.
That's a really good point, Bonnie. The economy has changed so much in the last 5 or 6 years, primarily because of the stresses and the pressures of very low economic growth rate. We're in a very atypical economic environment right now, and it's forcing massive changes in industry by industry. So a lot of the older norms simply don't apply anymore. And also you've got this tremendous upheaval in media channels. So again, a lot of the older norms don't apply anymore.
So back to our slides, interpretation, and thank you for all the questions. Interpretation, as we discussed when talking about key measures, the commercial must accomplish several very important tasks to be effective. We would not recommend that you put all your faith in one measure, whether that be recall or persuasion or image projection. It's not a one question, one measure that really will drive your advertising and brand. So we really need to analyze all the results, including the open-ended responses, and analyze those in relationship to what the marketing plan was and what the objectives are. We know that many times we're under tremendous timing pressure to get these ads approved and get them pushed out and get them on media and get them on air. But even if it's going back after a top line's delivered and looking at those open ends, that's very important.
We recommend as another best practice using some type of mathematical model or scoring system that takes multiple measures into account. And ideally the system would take attention value, message communication, persuasion, and it's relatively easy to build a scoring system or mathematical model that takes these core, key, essential measurements into account so that you come up with a scoring system that's not relying on one measure. Any one measure will invariably fail you.
Next, it's important to continue to use human judgment. There's no perfect pre-testing system, as we have already said. You can use it as a pre-testing as a light. It's not a crutch, and we're stealing that right from David Ogilvy. You know, we're not supposed to be a slave to the pre-testing system or the pre-testing scores. We really need to use our human judgment, understanding what's going on with our brand, what's going on with our competitive situation, economic forces. All of those things really need to work together in concert to give us the best informed decisions.
The ultimate goal of advertising is more powerful advertising. So advertising pre-testing gives us a way to continually improve and make the advertising better and better over time. Your advertising strategy should rarely change, but the creative executions may be changing all the time, and the testing system can help you tweak and refine and make sure that all of those executions are on strategy. Because the ultimate goal is to find a success formula that works for your brand. You know, having tested advertising for the last 30 to 40 years, we have become big believers in the power of advertising. You know, it's the power to influence the human mind. It's the power to shape the destiny of brands. Advertising has short-term power. It educates, it builds awareness, but it has long-term power to project a brand image, to appeal to powerful emotions. The potential and the promise of advertising, in our experience, is much greater than most corporations realize. So the full value of advertising is rarely achieved because most companies aren't doing the homework that really would lead to great and sustained advertising.
We have a couple other questions which we will get to, and feel free to send in any additional ones you may have. B2B and how we use pre-testing in a B2B environment. What would you say?
Well, in a B2B environment, it can get quite complicated because you might have not only a target audience, but you may have a group of influencers or gatekeepers in the case of pharmaceuticals. You may have to test the advertising among doctors as well as consumers. And of course the language would vary by industry, but advertising can have just as much effect in B2B markets as it can in consumer markets. And B2B markets are driven just as much by emotion as consumer is. That's not commonly believed, but we believe it based on our experience in the category.
And we know that many times sample is a struggle and a challenge in a B2B environment, so we may have smaller sample sizes, or maybe there are 25 or 30 in your sample size of your ad test as opposed to 200 or what we would do on the consumer side. Let's see, one other question. Campaign testing versus advertising testing, and what would we recommend there?
Very good question. There are two methods basically. One, you could pool the commercials, show them all to the consumer, show them 3 or 4, 5, 6, whatever the number of commercials in the campaign, show them all together, and then evaluate them as one commercial. The danger of this is that you have some good commercials and some bad commercials, and so you can't tease out which commercials are working and not. Another approach, and the approach that we typically recommend, is to test each commercial in the campaign separately, and then you can pool the results. But what we typically find is if you have 5 or 6 executions, 2 or 3 of them are really great and 2 or 3 of them are not so good. So you may then choose to run the best commercials only, or you may give them much more weight than the weaker commercials.
Okay. I think that is it, all the questions we have, and we're going to turn it over to Christy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jerry and Bonnie, and thank you everyone for attending today's Insider Series webinar on advertising pre-testing. If you have any questions, feel free to email Jerry or Bonnie. Our next Insider Series webinar will be Wednesday, November 9th. Decision Analyst John Collius will be presenting on fusing marketing research and data science. We hope you enjoyed today's session and are looking forward to seeing you for next month's webinar. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.